I want to say thank you to Hint for inviting me to address this esteemed group of healthcare professionals. From what I understand, I'm addressing a group of primary care physicians, direct care clinicians, benefits administrators, people in the support staff of the healthcare industry. And I think every position that you guys have and that I have, they're all important, but I think the healthcare industry is a noble profession. And I really just want to say thank you for doing that honorable work. See, I get lightheaded at the sight of blood. I cry when people cry. I vomit when people vomit. So an industry like yours, I was never cut out to be part of it. And it does. It takes a whole bunch of different types of people to make the world go round. And I'm just glad there are people like you in this world. So although your profession's different from mine, we have a lot in common. I'm the president and CEO of Bhang Corporation. We're publicly traded on the Canadian Securities Exchange under the symbol BHNG. And we're also traded on the American exchanges, the over-the-counter exchanges, under BHNGF, and F is for foreign because we're Canadian. So Hint asked me to present the story of how I became the CEO of a publicly traded company and what are the leadership insights that I've gained on my journey to CEO, and how did I get here? And essentially, I gave a speech a while ago called "Breaking the Glass Ceiling" that went viral in my industry, and Lynn Ann from Hint read it and asked me to give you a version of that speech and basically help you understand how I broke the glass ceiling and what are the tips that I have to offer from my experience. So in many ways, I think the concept of breaking the glass ceiling actually applies to the very people in the audience. A physician that untethers him or herself from an onerous non-compete, you want to do business on your terms. You want to treat patients without having somebody tell you how many minutes you have to spend in the room with them. And you basically have to do all of this without the giant support staff that comes with being employed by an industry. And so what you're doing is very similar to what I'm doing in that I'm working for a small cap company, and I've never been the CEO of a publicly traded company before. And I'm sure that you have long stories about what caused you to make the decision to untether, just like I do about how I got here. And so that's, really what I'm here to talk about is that what we both have in common is that we've broken through an established framework, and we're both sort of swimming upstream. And now I don't pretend to understand everything that you go through and don't want to, make too many comparisons where I might get it wrong. But that's what I envision as an outsider, is that it would be probably really hard to be on your own, hang your own shingle, and have to do everything yourself. And I can kind of sense that there's probably similarities. So in my journey to being CEO and the ongoing journey of being CEO, I definitely feel like I'm swimming upstream. It's hard work, and it's particularly hard work because of the industry that I'm in. I have to tell you, though, the job that I have is incredibly interesting. It's fun, and I get to do ridiculously cool things, and we'll talk about that later. So I don't really see myself as somebody who broke through a glass ceiling, and I think part of that is that people talk to me about, you're a woman leader, and I am a unicorn in the sense that there aren't that many of us that are running publicly traded companies. And so then I really got to thinking, why do I constantly get asked to tell this story? What is so interesting about it? And why don't I feel like I'm doing anything special? I'm just me being me. And I think part of that's because I'm a basketball player. I played college and high school basketball, and it was not unusual for me to play pickup basketball on a court with 9 guys and be the only female. And I often find myself in boardrooms and on phone calls. 90% of the time, I'm the only woman in the room or on the phone call. And it's just an environment that I'm comfortable in. So I think I grew up and, through my athletic endeavors, really grew comfortable being the only woman in a male dominated situation. And then the other part of that is that my first foray into business, I was a real estate investor for 25 years. And A lot of people assume that that meant I was a realtor because that's a title that they'll assume or, put on women. But I wasn't a realtor, and I've never had a realtor's license. I was actually putting my skin in the game. I was investing in property, and I was flipping before there was even a channel called HGTV. I was flipping houses and buying short sales. And so, that was definitely a male-dominated world, and I was having to give contractors instructions and really know their job better than them so that I could lead my projects in a way that was profitable, and do it in a way that I didn't really want to be perceived as being a bitch, and I think that's attributed to women leaders all the time if you're powerful. So I always tried to strike a balance between empathetic and understanding how to get what I needed so that the project I was running was profitable. So I think part of the reason I don't feel particularly like I've done anything too dramatic is that I'm super comfortable in the environment I'm in, being that I'm around a bunch of men all the time. But what I'll tell you I'm uncomfortable doing is the actual job of being CEO of a publicly traded company. And, I'll talk about sort of the ins and outs of that later. But I've taken the time to really reflect on why people ask me this and why actually I've come to realize it's really important that I have this position. So I'm going to walk through the history of the concept of the glass ceiling as a business construct. And then I'm going to circle back and talk a little bit about how all of us, that we have a sphere of influence. We're all leaders in some form or fashion. And what we have I think, mandate to do in this day and age is to break out of the paradigm of that notion of a glass ceiling. So the glass ceiling is really basically the idea that there's an arbitrary boundary that has to be overcome for one to achieve their rightful place. As you can look at my slide there, you can see that the term was coined in 1978 by an American management consultant named Marilyn Loren. So you get that visual. You can look up through the glass ceiling and you can see where the decisions are made, and you can see who's determining people's fates. But you're viewing all of that from beneath. But yet the companies and organizations are often built on the backs of the hard work of the women in those organizations. And so speaking from a business perspective, that intangible barrier has kept women, and I would argue people of color, from being in the rooms where decisions are made and where the power is brokered, because we weren't invited into the boardrooms and we weren't invited onto the golf courses where all of the big business happens. And so while I'm giving you this history, I want you to understand, I'm not giving you a fight the power talk, and this isn't about, fighting the man, and I'm not a man hater, so that's not it at all. But what I will tell you is, being asked often enough to speak about being a woman leader and how unique that is, I really got to thinking about, that it is really important that we understand how we got here. How did that framework get developed? And so I took a look at it, and that's how I figured out that Marilyn coined that term. And, I went and did the research. And I want you to think back in the 70s, the politicians, the CEOs, the presidents of universities, yacht clubs, golf clubs, they were not open to women. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that it was mandated that golf clubs had to allow women to be members. And so think about the fact that when you think about the leadership model that existed in the United States, think about the very picture on the wall that depicted the esteemed leadership of those golf clubs and yacht clubs and universities and those companies and those who our senators were. Think about the wall of pictures. What would that look like? And I would argue that we pretty much all have that image in our head. And look, I believe that people are basically good. And I believe that there was never a conspiracy. I don't think people were rubbing their hands together going, "Oh, we're going to exclude women and we're going to exclude people of color." I don't think that's how this all happened. I think what happened is human nature. And I think it's that back then, when only white men had the right to vote and the right to buy land and the right to make decisions and be in Congress and sit in the back of the bus or in the front of the bus, I think at that time, what happened was people did what people do. And they put people who look like them and sound like them and who went to their universities and joined their fraternities. They anointed each other. And they said, oh, there's a job open. Let's go ask Billy Joe Jim Bob over there that I went to college with. And essentially you had a bunch of guys in power who put a bunch more guys in power. And essentially we end up with that wall that looks just like that. And if you look at that slide that's up there, a woman or a person of color at the helm of a company or as the president of an institution, they would look totally out of place. And I would tell you, it would not be difficult for you to Google something like that, and that's what you're going to pop up. And this is the critical point that I'm really trying to make, and that really applies to all of us, is that the evolution of the framework that we operate in business, and I would argue in healthcare, resulted from that historical beginning. And what happened is now we operate under that framework. And that framework exists, and it was designed by and for the men that you see in those pictures, for one archetype. And so it is by its very nature exclusionary. So when someone like me shows up, and even though I'm comfortable in a room like that, I don't really fit in. I don't have the same framework. And so I'm going to come in and there's a little bit of a crack that goes into that glass ceiling. So the question is really, how did I get here? And I will tell you, it's because lots of people came before me and put cracks in the glass ceiling. They made it easier for people to break through, and they were outliers. And I don't know if you've all read the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, but he really just talks about being in the right place at the right time at a moment in history. And I would tell you that that's really how the glass ceiling got eventually shattered. And I would argue we're not there yet. We don't have leadership representative population at all. It still very much looks like that picture, but we're getting there. And to illustrate the point about the outliers concept and how I got here, I always think about that movie, The Post. If you've seen it, it was brilliant. Meryl Streep played Katharine Graham. It's a true story about how Katharine Graham was the editor of the Washington Post. She's the first female editor of a major newspaper, but she wasn't given the job because she was a great editor. She was given the job because her dad started that paper. And when he died, he gave it to her husband. And when he died, they had a marital pact and she ended up with the paper. And why it's significant is that during her tenure at the Post, Watergate happened. And the newspapers were all we're watching in real life, they're battling the president and they're trying to figure out, should they or shouldn't they publish this story? And she went ahead and broke the story. And had she been wrong, she would have lost everything. So she made a big decision. It took a ton of courage. And what she showed America is that a woman can be the leader of a major newspaper. She doesn't have to be a woman editor. She could just be a great editor. And she was. And she and other people that were people of color or other women that have had leadership positions have proven time and time again that we're capable of doing the hard job of making decisions and hiring and firing. And so give my hats off to Katharine Graham and the people before her that made it possible for someone like me to be the CEO of a publicly traded company. Without them, I wouldn't be here, I bet. So let's fast forward to today and let's look at that framework of business that was developed through that evolution. And while it's rare, we do have women and people of color in leadership positions. And so what I would say, though, is that we live now in a time where disruption is the buzzword. When we think about disruptive industries, disruptive companies, and we think about Uber disrupting the cab industry, and we're thinking about all of that, Netflix disrupting network television, and disrupting's become sexy. And so now we have these cracks in the glass ceiling. We have women and people of color in leadership proving time and time again. This would be my argument. You have to work, Michelle Obama said this, you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And you have to be twice as smart, and you have to be twice as prepared, and you have to be flawless every time you're out there talking, which I would argue then, if that's true, then Black and BIPOC leaders and women leaders are probably going to be outstanding by virtue of the fact of how hard they had to work to get where they're at. And so I would want us as a society to think about, in an era of disruption, that maybe it's time for us to understand that the concept of a glass ceiling only really exists if we agree and are complicit with the rules of engagement created by the very establishment of that framework. We don't have to do that. Cannabis is the industry that I come from. I'm the CEO of a cannabis company, and we're a real industry. We have multinational public companies, supply chain issues, cross-border mergers and acquisitions, leaders, experts, conferences, insurance. We almost have banking. We're not there yet. But over the last 20 years, the cannabis industry has made huge strides towards legalization. And we are disrupting big business. We're disrupting big pharma, big alcohol, and big tobacco. And those three big companies represent a lobby that is incredibly powerful, and they have been resistant to the cannabis industry since day one. But what you start to read in the newspaper is some of the bigger players like Constellation Brands put a $5 billion investment in Canopy Growth, one of the larger Canadian LPs. They're starting to hedge their losses, and they're starting to understand that you can't put this genie back in the bottle. And the beauty of the cannabis industry is that we don't operate in the same framework of business, because most of the people that are in this industry from 20 years ago came out of the shadows. And in the shadows, it's whoever had the rocks to get in the business. And so you've got a bunch of courageous leaders in our industry that are blazing the trail, pun intended, and making it possible for people to use cannabis out in the open. What I would tell you is that we're creating a new framework where women and people of color are welcome. And I would say that for the very people listening to this at this moment, you are also living proof that it's possible to reject the normal paradigm of business as usual. As rare as it is for a woman CEO to be hiring and firing and making courageous decisions, you are also in an industry as an independent healthcare provider or a support person in independent healthcare, swimming upstream and creating a framework that doesn't look like the framework of business and disrupting healthcare. So we have that in common. What I will tell you is your sphere of influence and the practices that you run and the practices that you administer and that you support, being that they're disruptive, you have an opportunity to think about very deliberately the type of leadership that you include. And I would argue that it's incumbent upon all of us to give access to a diverse group of people that don't look like us and talk like us, because that's where the magic happens. You're not just serving white men. I'm not just serving white men. And so if I'm going to include women and people of color in the decision-making process and in having the power to make decisions and to give input, what ends up happening is we end up having the ability to operate our businesses more profitably. And what I'll say to you directly is that diverse leadership isn't just a social justice issue. It's also good for the bottom line. Companies are 30% more profitable when they have diverse leadership. That's an Ernst & Young statistic. And I will tell you, it's benefited Bhang. Our leadership team is entirely made up of women. So how did I get here? I'm going to tell you a quick story, starting from the beginning. It's going to foreshadow how I got here, and I'll make it quick. I was a high school and college basketball point guard. I grew up in Absaroka, Montana. If you look at that slide, it's a single street cow town, population 800 in the Valley of the Rocky Mountains. And basketball is religion in Absaroka because that's pretty much all there is to do. And so Being a basketball player in that small town, I had a graduating class of 26 people. I was related to about 5 of them, and that's pretty typical. So that's where I came from. And while I was in Absarka, we would drive up and down that main street. We would cruise Maine. We would raise Black Angus cattle. That's my next slide. And we literally had 1 country music station, 2 television stations. And when I was growing up, my dad was growing cannabis. In fact, he's been growing cannabis for 55 years. He's a Vietnam vet, and he found that he doesn't drink alcohol and never has, but he's found that cannabis relieves anxiety for him, and he couldn't get access to it, and he didn't want to take prescription meds. I've grown up around cannabis my entire life. And from Absarka, I went on to New York, and I went to Vassar College, and I then went from there to law school. And from there, I went and got a master's in educational leadership at the University of Oregon. And fun fact on my journey, my first cousin on my mom's side is DJ Muggs from Cypress Hill. And while I was in law school, he was on Saturday Night Live and he lit a joint on national television. So there's another little insight into how I ended up in cannabis. So I grew up a small town, ranch ethic, basketball playing, super competitive, highly educated woman. And I didn't ever use cannabis. I was an athlete. So post-college, I got married. I started a real estate investment company. And DJ Muggs and I invested in real estate. We've been real estate investors and partners for the last 16 or 17 years. So fast forward, cannabis is legalized. He wants to do a deal for Cypress Hill. And he asks me to read a contract. And I read it. I send him the notes on why it was onerous. And he wrote back and said, you should find us a weed deal. And so, yada, yada, yada. I found Bhang 5 years ago. And now I'm the CEO of a publicly traded company. Bhang's in its 10th year of operation. And our former CEO and founder stepped down from the CEO position a year ago. So I've been in this position a year. And it has been a wild ride. The title of president's caused a noticeable change in the way people treat me and the people who want access to me, people who want to be part of my circle. And one of the things I figured out was that early on, I get to make the decisions. And I was used to doing that in my real estate business. But cannabis is a business where Black and brown people are sitting in prison. It is not uncommon. And I would argue, in fact, there are tens of thousands of Black and brown people sitting with life without the possibility of parole, and they've been caught with less than an ounce of pot. And knowing that, and knowing that I'm a decision maker, and knowing that our company is selling millions of dollars of cannabis-infused chocolate, I realize that really it's important that I deliberately include people of color in my decision-making world. And that I deliberately seek them out to do business with them. And I deliberately seek them out to employ. And I deliberately seek them out as vendors because we've built this business on their backs. And what I would say in healthcare, when I think about Henrietta Lacks and I think about the Tuskegee experiments, and I understand that that's, the medical world's, dirty past, and none of you were probably involved in that, nor was I in putting people in prison. But the reality is there's some brokenness in this industry and in the healthcare industry. And I do believe that if we know that it makes us better and more profitable and it's a social justice issue, I had this aha moment and said, it's incumbent upon me as a leader to make these decisions on purpose. And so that's what I've been doing. So I want to put this in perspective though. Bhang's a small cap company. And if you were to talk about the New York Stock Exchange like Disneyland and the TSX, the Toronto venture like County Fair, the Canadian Securities Exchange is like the lemonade stand at the County Fair. Bhang's trading around 10 cents. So normally what happens is if you're the CEO of, let's say, Disney or Nike, you're going to have a whole building of people that are going to do the capital market stuff. And what I will tell you is that I'm doing all of that. So I got thrust into this position and I'm making these decisions, and I have this social equity thing in the back of my mind as being really important. And and germane to what I'm doing as a leader. And having a master's degree in leadership, educational leadership, and having a degree in women's studies, and having a 25-year career in real estate investment didn't really prepare me for mergers and acquisitions, warrants, stocks, options, filing all the forms, and understanding corporate governance and how a board should and shouldn't be informed of things and when. And so I'm learning all of that. Mm-hmm.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're actually coming up right on our time to move to the next session. Thanks, Jamie.
Thank you.